Hi, Vera.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, sorry for all of that. Glad
No,
you're
no worries. That happens. Yeah, no worries.
You guys want to hold for a moment or get started at this point? Maybe a couple minutes.
Sure, sure. We can wait another minute or two. And
Yeah, maybe not another minute or two. I would say no longer than that.
Hello, all those of you who are here. We're just waiting another minute or so, not even, before we jump into our conversation. But we appreciate you all being here. All right, I think we're going to jump into things. Let me introduce myself before I introduce our panelists. My name is Gene Park. I do see some familiar names in the attendees list, but my name is Gene Park. I am a Cherry Hill resident, but I am also the principal of A. Russell Knight Elementary School here in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, Cherry Hill School District. I also am a co-chair of our cultural proficiency and equity and character education district committee as well. And I'm really excited to be having this conversation about supporting social emotional well-being of API students. And we have a really top-notch panel here who will provide some insights within that topic. And so let me do some introductions. So again, thanks for all of you being here. I know it'll be a fruitful time for everyone. So first, we have Daniel Park. He's currently studying to be a doctoral level school psychologist and a behavior analyst at the Graduate School of Applied and Professional Psychology at Rutgers University. He's also the youth group director at a local church in Cherry Hill and has been working with Korean American adolescents for the past 8 years. He was a former classroom assistant at the Douglas Developmental Disability Center at Rutgers University and has experience working with adolescents and adults with autism. We also have Dr. Vera Lee, who's currently an associate clinical professor of literacy studies at Drexel University School of Education. And she teaches courses for the pre-K to 4 readings, teaches courses for pre-K to 4 reading specialists and ESL specialist programs. She's a former middle school language arts and a high school English teacher. She did this for 7 years in PA as well as New Jersey. And lastly, we have Jessica Kim, who's a licensed clinical social worker with over 15 years of experience helping youth, adults, and families across a variety of different settings, hospitals, schools, agencies, government, as well as private practice. She is a community organizer and serves on the board of Make Us Visible New Jersey, as well as Asian American Alliance in South Jersey, and is currently a PhD candidate in social welfare at the School of Social Policy and Practice at the University of Pennsylvania. So we have these three folks will be providing brief presentations on some content. And then from there, the tail end of our webinar, we will open the door to questions and be able to have the panelists respond. And if you would like to ask a question, right at the bottom of your screen where it says Q&A, it's near the participants, between participants and chat, you can drop your questions in there and we will do our very best to respond to them. So without further ado, our first speaker, I believe, will be Daniel Park. Is that correct? All right, Daniel, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks so much, Gene. Just making sure I'm sharing this. All right, great. So good evening, everyone. I'm just going to be talking about a topic that is very important, and it's the topic of being able to listen to API youth. And so, goals for just for at least my short portion, we're going to be talking about just active listening, why it's important. Just a very nice analogy to kind of help us understand better ways that we can participate and practice active listening, and then some practical tips. All right. And so I just really like this quote. I think it's something that we've probably have all heard at least once somewhere, where most people do not listen with the intent to understand. They listen with the intent to reply. And we'll kind of see why that's kind of important. And maybe it's a temptation that we often fall trapped to as well. So this is a big question, right? Why is this an important consideration within our AAPI community? So, really, there's this deep sense of respect, right? Typically for the wisdom that elders carry across, most AAPI cultures. And that respect really extends out in so many ways, right? So it takes form in hierarchies within our family structures, having to listen without opportunities to respond, obeying, setting aside often our own personal wishes and agendas so that we can often maintain some type of harmony and peace while respecting whoever the elder person is. Right. And so we see that as we get older, we're often, tempted to start modeling that type of similar behavior in ourselves for our youth and kids. And because that's how, respect was modeled for us. Right. So the temptation is to believe that we know what's best for our kids all the time. Oftentimes we do. Right. But even oftentimes as parents, educators, or even as youth leaders, we always have to problem solve for our kids, right? And so we're so used to trying to help solve so many things on their behalf without, even taking into consideration how they feel or possibly how they're trying to navigate through those situations. So it's kind of interesting that we're taught to really listen so well at an early age, and then somehow lose those skills as we become older and older, which is pretty interesting. And so active listening. So the drive-through model that I'm going to be talking about is very simple. It's a very easy way to understand what active listening is. And I was thinking about it, and I think those who work, who work in the drive-through at your local fast food joint are probably one of the best at active listening. So we want to consider this model as if we were the person taking the order at a fast food restaurant drive-through. And if you'll humor me, my favorite fast food joint is Chick-fil-A. I love their service, I love their food, and I love their sauces even more. And I'm sure you guys always are taking extra home, just like I am. But simply, right, the drive-through model is simply active listening, right? Is just what happens at a drive-through. Your child is like the customer coming to order. They're coming to you with something they need to have addressed. And what happens when you order something at a drive-through? Right? The attendant simply just affirms what you just said. Right? And so they're attending to your needs. Notice how most good attendants will not tell you how you should order or what you should go and do instead. And that's our temptation right there, right? To tell our kids that they need to do X or Y and how they should go about it instead of making sure that we're actively listening to them first, right? And then attendants do this great job of summarizing everything we just said after our order, right? And that's exactly what we want to do for our kids, so that they feel that they were just heard, and so after we listen and summarize what our kids had to say, we want to provide some sort of empathetic statements, right, and about how they're feeling, so that they really feel validated. So this can sound like saying, "Hey, I'm sorry that it was a really hard day for you," or just saying things like, "That must have been really annoying to deal with." It's very important here, right, that we don't minimize anything that they're trying to say. by comparing it to our present or past struggles as a person listening, right? But we really want to make sure to keep this about the child, right? And so then the attendants at the drive-through, they confirm everything you just said and ordered, and they use this another great technique, which we call probing, right? And ask if there's anything else we would like to order, right? So after a child shares whatever it was that they needed to share, we just want to make sure that we follow up and be sure to ask if they felt like they need to talk about anything else, or if they would like help with the issue at hand. And what really asking ourselves, like, and to the child, what can I do to help make you feel better? Is there anything I can do? Or even follow up questions to what was just asked, right? So this drive-through model is just a very simple analogy to really just kind of help us to have the tools to really practice active listening. And if you guys have any questions, please don't hesitate to drop it in the Q&A. I think that's a great feature for us to be able to use. And so what are some ways to respond and encourage responses, right? One of the ways that we want to help our kids to feel validated, you always want to thank them for sharing. I think sometimes it's very hard to share things that make us vulnerable, or just share things that have happened. So you always want to thank them for just feeling like they're able to come to you and share. This is another great way to kind of gather more information, and this idea of open and close-ended questions. It's a good rule of thumb if you want to ask, or if you're trying to gather more information, to always ask more open-ended questions. This is more like how, why, these types of questions. And close-ended questions, they're probably going to best be used to confirm the information that you just heard. So close-ended questions are typically ones, right, you can answer with yes or no. And so just to help make sure that child understood that, you heard everything that they just said, that's probably a good time to just use those close-ended questions just to make sure you heard correctly. And this is like kind of going back to the pieces that we just touched on. Try not to provide advice unless explicitly asked to. Sometimes our kids are not ready to kind of hear that at first. They just want to be able to just share just really what's been going on before they're even in a place to be ready to listen. And this idea of rolling with resistance, there are going to be times where maybe you're going to try to, dig a little bit deeper about what they just shared, about an experience that they had, and they might not be ready to do that just yet. And so I think as a caregiver, as a parent, as a leader or a teacher, or in whatever position that you're in, just being patient and just kind of patiently waiting for the child to be able to share when that they're ready to, it's probably going to be a good idea to continue just to build that connection with the child, to make sure that they feel that, there's a safe space to share these things. And just to wrap up, just some 3 simple practical tips. Be creative, be patient, and never be afraid to ask for help. I think sometimes we're kind of scared to do the last one. But, being creative, right? For parents, when you're trying to find ways to kind of talk more with your child, or maybe you feel that your child doesn't feel like they can come to you, think about where you guys talk the most or argue the most. These are probably the spaces and time that they're trying to talk to you, because that's probably when they have your attention. When I kind of reflect back on my own time, aside from all of these things that my parents try to sign me up for and do, I often found myself talking to my parents, or arguing with them the most during car rides. And so that's probably a space where we want to be able to practice these things. I think the car rides are the most underrated, because you're either listening to music or it's just quiet. But typically I feel like that's kind of a space where a lot of interaction and conversations take place. And again, being patient, this is huge. Our children aren't gonna always move the way that we want them to, or feel comfortable sharing when we would want them to share. And so just being patient and offering that space is always just going to be helpful. And again, asking for help, I think there's no shame in doing that. Just being able to, ask, school personnel, or asking for more resources in terms of how we can reach our child, because, we want to be able to help them, and it's about them first. So yeah, those are just some practical and quick ways for us to be able to practice active listening, and ways for us to listen to our youth. Thank you, guys.
Great. Daniel, thank you so much for getting us started and sharing that content. Definitely helpful and having that conversation about active listening and how we could better respond to our children for sure. And now I've introduced you already to Dr. Vera Lee. She'll be speaking specifically to creating a culturally responsive community for AAPI youth, as well as their families. So Dr. Lee.
Thank you so much. I appreciate just everyone inviting me here today, and thank you again for the introduction, Principal Park. So when I received sort of note about the topic of this particular webinar being about supporting AAPI youth, I wanted to approach it from the lens of being a teacher educator. So that's the field that I'm in. I'm a teacher educator of elementary teachers and in-service teachers. And to think about like, how could the school community provide greater supports for AAPI youth and their families? I mean, the caregivers are a really, really important part of, I think, the social and academic and emotional development of their children. Okay, let's see. So I wanted to start with just some data that I thought was particularly interesting, just to kind of contextualize my really, really brief discussion points today. One is that actually AAPI communities are two of the three fastest growing racial ethnic groups in the US. That's according to recent US Census Bureau data, and that 71% of Asian American adults were born outside of the US. So most of them are not born in the US, and I think that's really important to know that as we think about the parents that we interact with. And AAPI communities are extremely diverse. And so these are not, monolithic, monocultural communities, right? It's not just 2 or 3 different cultural representations, but they're representing vast numbers of countries, over 100 different languages, and probably more than that if you include dialects. And English language learners comprise a pretty large percentage of our total student population in the US, so 10.2%. However, conversely, even though I think all of the Department of Education data indicates increasingly diverse classrooms across the US from now till 2025, on the opposite end of the spectrum, our teaching force is not very diverse, right? So we have only 2% of teachers are Asian American, less than 1%. Principal Park is in a real minority category. Less than 1% of school leaders are Asian American, and less than 0.5% are actually Pacific Islanders. So, we're not going to see many Asian American Pacific Islander youth actually having AAPI teachers or school leaders in any of their K-12 experience. I just want to contextualize that. And in Cherry Hill, AAPIs, meaning adults and kids, represent the second largest racial ethnic group in our township. So that's according to census data of 2019. So what are some current issues facing AAPI youth? AAPI youth are really differently identified. So, I think we tend to see the racial, ethnic, or linguistic social categories, but there are also a percentage of them who identify as LGBTQ youth, and they have experienced quite a bit of bullying and harassment in schools. That's according to recent data in January of 2022. And then I think this doesn't come as a surprise that over half of them, in a survey taken actually of a pretty large population of California youth back in 2016, half of them reported they had not taken any classes where their culture, history, or identities were ever presented or discussed. English language learners would be a special category, and there's not enough time for me to talk about this, but we're talking about migrants, voluntary immigrants, refugees. All of them require different types of supports and resources for teachers and school staff to consider. But a lot of them do deal with social isolation, language barriers, because there's this idea that they can only speak English in the classroom, and that's the only language that's acceptable. Certainly there's identity issues around socialization, around trying to figure out who they are culturally, being born elsewhere, but coming here to the States. And certainly this unfelt or very felt experience or pressure to assimilate. I think what was also striking is that Eastside, which is the Cherry Hill newspaper, student-led newspaper, they had actually conducted a survey earlier this year, and there are over 300 students that responded, students of color. Among them, of course, would be AAPI students, but they reported that almost 35% of them believed that there was a racist environment at Cherry Hill East. So this is not just sort of this problem that's existing elsewhere, but this is very much located locally, even within one of our two, high schools in the town. And then on the other side of it are the parents. And I think that oftentimes parents are invisible in these discussions about supporting youth when they are very much at the front lines, and they're the first parents and the first educators of our youth. And I think that one of the issues, particularly when we are talking about immigrant caregivers, and you saw the statistics, over 70% are not born in the US, that the way that we perceive of educational involvement is often misunderstood when you're talking about parents from different cultures in which involvement looks very different. And it could be that for certain AAPI communities, to approach a teacher, to approach a school staff or principal may seem as if that's not something you're supposed to do in their home country. And so there are other ways that actually they're actively involved in the education of their children, but those are not typically normative or accepted behaviors that emulate middle-class white families, right, in the US, like being the muffins for mom, the PTA officer, or being the fundraising parent. Those are not the kinds of things that immigrant parents are used to. And we have to understand that the way in which involvement is defined looks very different depending on the cultural context. Also, language barriers are a very real obstacle. They don't feel comfortable or confident if that is the dominant language, which we know it is, in Cherry Hill schools. If they don't feel like they could communicate with school staff or teachers, they're very reluctant to actually to engage or to be the ones to reach out, even if they have questions or concerns about their child. That also leads to them not feeling really welcomed or invited. If all of the meetings, back to school night, teacher parent meetings are all in English, that doesn't really, it's not conducive to a very welcoming environment for parents when they're not able to communicate fluently or really understand everything that's being communicated. And a lot of research also talks about just lack of time and resources. Immigrant parents, they are working, they have multiple responsibilities, very common for them to work more than one job. They've got childcare issues, different generations of family members they're taking care of. And to think about how can schools think about, offering different ways and different modalities to be able to have these parent-centered events that are not just for the 9 to 5 working parents, right? And finally, I think this is really important, is navigating an entirely new school system that is unfamiliar, right? So I think that's also a big issue. So very quickly, and you could see the slide, there's just some really practical ways that for educators, because I'm in teacher education, I think a lot about my pre-service and inter-service teachers in terms of supporting AAPI youth, is just get to know your individual students. Again, they're not a monolithic category. They're not all the same. They're individual students with individual educational backgrounds, family histories, immigration stories. Get to know those stories. Think about how you could see their cultural and linguistic capital as resources to really be able to integrate into your classroom in some way. Make an effort to get to know the parents. That is incredibly important. The parents have all sorts of information that school records are not going to provide. And reaching out to parents with a genuine interest to know about their child goes a long way in establishing some positive relationships. Also invite the parents, utilize their cultural capital as well to be able to share their traditions and experiences with your students. They're an underutilized resource, I believe. And just create this classroom environment where you let them know in symbolic and explicit ways that you affirm who they are and that they don't have to change who they are or the languages they speak to fit in. And that also for English language learners, they will need help with socializing in the classroom. So even helping them build relationships with other students will go a long way. And finally, just to take a critical eye towards your school curricula and assessments for cultural bias, there are ways in which we as American, all of us being, if we're born and raised in America, we tend to not see things very myopically, but for someone who's born in a different country, those sort of things that are assessed that show up in standardized tests or curriculum-based assessments may not be something within the scope of a background of an ELL. So some things to think about. And finally, last slide, for school leaders, to create an inclusive environment for families, same with children, you have to make it visible that this is a space where being multicultural and multilingual is welcomed and invited. So having signage in multiple languages, a welcome sign in multiple languages, know what are your major languages of diffusion. Thinking about, do you need translators to be at events? Do you need translation services to be made available through the phone, AT&T translation line, or different multilingual speakers at the front office? The second one is hugely important. What do we have set up in the school district to help immigrant parents navigate the school system and the district system and processes? Because that is essential for their success and their child's success. Instead of asking why aren't AAPI parents involved in the way that we want them to be involved? I would say to flip the script to say, how do immigrant parents want to be involved, right? And oftentimes they might give you an answer that's different from the muffins, for mom, or the mom's fundraisers. All of that is great, but that may not be within the scope of their comfort level, okay? And then PTA meetings, it's unless you have the resource of translation, AAPI families who do not, or parents who do not speak English, that's not going to be a place where they feel they could get anything out of those meetings. This is a huge one that that's a sticking point for me, is oftentimes generational conflicts occur because AAPI youth are being asked to act as the parent. So please do not ask them to be translators on behalf of their parents. It really is an uncomfortable dynamic for the families. So again, offering that resource of having adult translators, community volunteers, I think will be really, really important. And lastly, just offering professional development to teachers. Like, a lot of teachers may not know where to begin to have these critical conversations about anti-racism. That could be something that would be really, really meaningful. Helping them develop as culturally responsive educators, and then giving them additional supports and how to think holistically about supporting their AAPI ELLs in the classroom, and integrating parents meaningfully in the school community. So that's it for me. Well, thank you very much.
Dr. Lees, thank you so much for just the information that you shared, and highlighting the importance of really creating a culturally responsive community environment for our students as well as their families. And also I want to highlight the fact that you just were able to share so many different ways that we can actually make that vision become more of a reality. So I will say, as an educator in Cherry Hill, I was encouraged as well as challenged and convicted in regards to the fact that we are doing a lot of work in these areas and moving in the right direction, but still pushed to know that we still have a long way to go as well. I would like to introduce Jessica Kim, who I gave you a bio of previously, and she will be sharing content around using education to stop Asian hate. Jessica, the floor is yours.
Forgot I was muted. Okay, so thank you, Jean. I'm going to present very briefly on using education to stop Asian hate. I'm going to cover 3 points. First, the rising Asian hate we've been seeing during this pandemic. Secondly, how it's been affecting Asian youth. And lastly, the importance of teaching API history and contributions in school. So since COVID-19, we've seen a surge in rising hate crimes against Asians in America. And unless you've been, I don't know, living under a rock for the last 2 years, if you're Asian, I mean, you know about this already, right? But just in case, some of our listeners may be hearing this for the first time, I feel compelled to just put this on everybody's radar again. So according to Stop API Hate Data, this is a national database that's tracked these incidents since March 2020. There have been 11,000 self-reported hate incidents against Asian Americans. That's a 339% increase, reported last year compared to the year before. In the summer of 2020, the youth campaign of Stop API Hate, they interviewed 1,000 Asian students all across the country. And they wanted to look at the emotional impact that this, xenophobia was having on Asian young people. And what they found was that, a lot of Asian youth were just really angry, disappointed, and feeling depressed and worried about their family members and just really scared. They reported verbal harassment, various forms of shunning and degradation. Here's one quote from an adolescent male. "My classmates said that the pandemic is due to bad decision-making by Chinese people and aimed this comment at me because I was the only Asian student at the table. They also stated that pandemics and global issues are always the fault of Chinese people." And what's also really interesting about these findings is that when they split that sample of 1,000 students into those who did and did not directly experience a hate incident, there really wasn't a significant difference in distress. Their distress levels were pretty similar. So in other words, this rising Asian hate was impacting the Asian student community as a whole. It wasn't just those who were directly attacked. So what's going on? We know from a comprehensive meta-analysis that was done across all racial minority groups that these racialized stresses and emotions, they impact youth of color and their mental health. It can cause feelings of self-doubt. It impacts their self-confidence. There's this tendency toward physical isolation and more severe repercussions sometimes, like depression or self-harm. But we also know that Asian Americans are 3 times less likely to seek help. And compared to white Americans, and there's lots of reasons for this, but one of them is the lack of culturally responsive services. That includes everything from, not being able to recognize, cultural expressions of distress and do proper assessments, language barriers like we, heard Vera talk about, and the lack of Asian providers, right, who can understand their cultural background and cultural issues. So then how do we begin to mitigate Asian hate, right, and address these mental health issues if there are so many barriers to mental health service use? And I think this is where the importance of education comes in. Make Us Visible New Jersey is a coalition group that partnered with over 60 other groups throughout the state. And we advocated for the inclusion of Asian American history and contributions in K-12 education. Why? Because we know that there's really no quick and easy solution, right, to fighting hate and ignorance. I mean, that's going to take forever. How do you address this? People fear things that they don't understand, people that they don't know. And because of the invisibility of Asian American stories, most of us never learned about Asian Americans being part of the fabric of this country. So not only can learning about Asian American history help to mitigate Asian hate, I think it could also help Asian students to understand that they belong, to this country, and that actually helped to build this nation that we call home, And this is about ensuring that all of our students feel seen, represented, and accepted for who they are. I grew up back in the 80s and 90s when people were still calling us Oriental. Whenever I saw an Asian person on the screen, we were always portrayed as foreigners. Right? Long Duk Dong, like 16 Candles, Data from the Goonies, Mr. Miyagi from Karate Kid, Bruce Lee, Jackie Chan, right? Full Metal Jacket, Me Love You Long Time. Everybody remembers that. The implicit bias, that I guess was on everyone's mind, is this idea that Asians are outsiders, Okay, we are awkward, we're geeky, we're the kung fu masters, right? Exotic and objectified. We never learned about Asian American history. We never learned about our scientists, our activists, right? People who shaped the country's labor unions and our civil rights movement, about the first woman of color elected to Congress, about any of our artists. We never learned that we had the most decorated combat unit in the history of the US Army, right? All of these narratives were erased. And one aspect of privilege is when your history is taught as core curriculum and mine is taught as an elective. Okay, I can personally attest that these racialized tropes and the invisibility, it really impacts how you feel about yourself as a kid. And it impacts how you even feel about other Asians too. It induces feelings of shame and inferiority. It impacts the way that teachers, classmates, and neighbors see you. It robs children of the chance to fully develop their identity because they don't see themselves represented in their learning environment in a positive way. Okay, and this is why including API history and contributions is so important. I want to make sure tonight also that everyone in Cherry Hill in particular feels very proud because our town held a very critical rally for fighting for the teaching of API history back in December. And this is a photo of that day. Hosted at my church, Grace Ministry. And we had the support of the chair of the Education Committee, Assemblywoman Pamela Lampett. We had Mayor Susan Shin Angulo, Councilwoman Sangeeta Doshi, Superintendent Dr. Joe Malash, and lots of parents, youth, and coalition groups like API Montclair. We all came out and rallied for this bill. And we now know that it was signed into law on January 18th, 2022 by Governor Murphy, making New Jersey the second state in the entire country to mandate the inclusion of API studies in K-12 education. We also know that a commission for Asian American heritage within the DOE was also legislated. And this commission, although it's not finalized yet, is really intended to oversee the implementation to ensure that the curriculum is supported throughout the state. So all of this should really give Asian American families, I think, a lot of hope, not just in our district, but in the state and in the rest of the country, that things can become more equitable for the next generation. And closing, I want to say that as a mental health professional, I value the emotional well-being of all young people. And ultimately, this is about humanizing people that maybe we don't always necessarily hang out with. Learning more about each other and about ourselves is really the best way to build empathy and to equip our young people to become the next leaders, of our ever-growing and ever-diverse nation, to be better, right, than we were and to do better than we did. These are resources that we can share at the end. This includes things like translated mental health resources in various Asian American languages. There's Asian therapist directories, as well as free API lesson plans that are grade specific. So please check these resources out. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. Definitely looking forward to taking a peek more closely at all of those resources that were shared. And just want to highlight the piece that you shared just about that empathy piece. I think we as human beings have the ability to do that, and yet it is probably an area, a muscle that we don't flex enough, whether we're children, adults, in education or not, in leadership roles. And I do agree, as we grow that muscle, I think we can again use it to move towards a world that we would more like to look more like what we would envision. And so for our audience, number one, thanks again for being here. I hope even just the presentations at this point have been a great learning experience for you. You've learned something, and also we hope that they've generated questions, right? We can't get to better solutions until we continue to ask better questions. And so we welcome both We do welcome questions, and right now I will pose some questions to our panel, and they will open with some dialogue around those questions. Please feel free to add questions in the Q&A section for me to pose to the panel. And so the first question we'll kick off with is this one. Why do you believe it was important to hold this webinar fully devoted to talk about Asian American students or Asian students, and specifically what's different or unique about the mental health challenges of API students? And I'll open that to the panel.
I could start. I think that it's important to acknowledge that, it's really all youth in general right now, not just Asians who are going through really a collective mental health crisis. The American Academy of Pediatrics declared it a national emergency last year in child and adolescent mental health. Our system is really, unfortunately, not adequately resourced right now to meet the rising needs. So I just want to acknowledge that, but that's really a whole other webinar too. When it comes to Asian students, though, I think that we have a lot of stereotypes about Asian kids that makes it really important to address their mental health in a more explicit way. We have all kinds of assumptions that we make because of these model minority stereotypes, and it contributes to this implicit bias that we tend to see Asian American students as kind of all being the same, all being smart, hardworking, right? You've all heard this or felt this or perceived this, well-behaved, maybe a little stoic. They don't have many problems, right? You get the idea. And at first, I don't think most people understand why these assumptions can be harmful. It's kind of like, that's, it's a good thing, right? Isn't that a positive stereotype, right? But no, it's actually very harmful, these assumptions. For example, if teachers are assuming that their Asian students are fine because they're not disruptive in class, or they're maintaining decent grades, that's a missed opportunity, to help someone who may be struggling mentally and emotionally. So that's why it's really important to intentionally hold space for things like tonight's webinar, I think, where we have information and discussions that are deliberately centering some of the perspectives of Asian Americans. I think, Vera really talked about this very well, the diversity of Asian Americans, to know who it is that we're even talking about. New Jersey, the top 5 Asian American ethnic groups are Indians, Chinese, Filipino, Korean, and Pakistani in that order. But overall, Asians make up 10% of the population in New Jersey. And there's only 2 other states in the whole country that have larger percentages than that, which is Hawaii and California. So we have a significant number of Asian American students we need to be accountable to. I'll just stop there. I have more that I can add, but I do want to give others a chance to chime in if people have stuff to say.
And I will pose, Daniel, you look like you were just about to jump in. There was a request if we would be able to share the slide decks with audience members, and you guys, the panel members, can respond by the end. We'll let you know. Go ahead, Daniel.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, obviously this pandemic has also not helped, with the type of mental health challenges that our students, and specifically API students, have been experiencing. And if anything, it's probably exacerbated a lot of the anxiety, the depression that, a lot of our students are really struggling with. But I think there are these new tools that a lot of school districts now have. For example, a school district that I'm interning at currently, with the use of Chromebooks and a lot of these online tools, we have these programs and software that are now catching particular words that students are sharing with one another, whether it's in class or through email, such as like self-harm, and using language like, oh, I think I might die, like, and all these types of very, scary language. And it's not to say that these things weren't happening, but now we have these tools that are suddenly catching these things. And it makes me just wonder, are our schools prepared for the increased number of students with these types of needs? Because it's like one of those things before where it's like, look, we kind of know what's happening, but we're not able to address it because we're not exactly sure whether it's been explicitly said or not. But now that we have these programs and softwares to even catch that, I think it raises another level of accountability for just schools and for just different types of academic areas to just really be ready to kind of meet the needs of our students that where these things might be happening.
I would like to pose a question from Mr. or Mrs. Nash. So how do we respond to people who would say Asian Americans are already high achievers? Some of the stereotypes you may have mentioned, they're already high achievers. They have much higher median income than most. Why do we need to be providing more support for Asian Americans when there may be other groups that have greater needs?
So if I could just jump in and just, just mentioned how the model minority myth that came out of the 1960s, I think had really altered the public's perception, literally sort of pointing to Asian American communities and saying, they pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Why can't other communities of color do the same? And I think the data that I showed on my initial slide that AAPI communities are very diverse. It's not just in terms of culture, language, race, and ethnicity, but it's also along socioeconomic lines. Yes, there are some AAPI communities who do well socioeconomically, but that does not mean that our youth are not in need of other types of supports that are often invisible, as Jess had pointed to, and Daniel as well. But I would also argue that we do have AAPI communities who are not well off or not successful. They're struggling. Again, we look at our immigrant communities, they are not coming in with vast numbers of resources. They have to start from the very beginning just to build their life here in the US. So I would say it's important to just learn more about who AAPI individuals and families are in the US, to just get more, to just read more about their experiences in the US, to find out that there is a diversity of lived experiences. And so I think that we have to be really careful that I think the model minority myth, I think, has unfortunately masked a lot of other types of disparities that do exist within and between these communities.
Thank you for sharing that, Vera. And I'll shift this into the next question. If you could share just some examples that you've seen of how schools are supporting and engaging Asian parents who really want to be more connected, but may not see the opportunities to do so in their child's school. They may find it difficult because of cultural or language barriers. Where have you seen some good examples of how people have broken down those barriers?
So I do a lot of my research actually on multilingual school parent engagement efforts in the school district of Philadelphia. And some of the examples that I've seen that have worked really well, and I'm going to use Southwark because that is the most diverse. Half of their school population is ELL. And it's in South Philadelphia. But one of the things that they've done is they've hired multilingual counseling assistants, and these are not just translators, but these are parent liaisons that represent major language groups in their school. So they've got one for Burmese families. They have an MCA, they have one for Spanish speaking families, Mandarin, etc. The role of the MCA is really important because if you look at the School District of Philadelphia website, they're there to provide support in all the different ways family need support. So things like connections to healthcare, social services, employment, immigration rights, attorney contact information, housing. I mean, you name it, they're there. It's almost like a full service type of resource. In addition, they're helping with translating critical documents, IEPs, permission forms, those types of things, sitting in on parent meetings with counselors. But I would say one of the other things that have worked really well is they have PTA groups, and I shared this with Principal Park and Jess and Daniel a few days ago, but they have PTA groups that are actually bilanguage groups, and how that's really helped the multilingual families in that community thrive is that they feel like they've created like this community network together that's been really vital. So if they miss a meeting, they're texting one another and catching up on the information. They're sharing information back with other parents. But also that's where they're able to ask those questions they're embarrassed to ask in a larger PTA meeting. What does the PSS8 test actually mean? That's the standardized test that they use in Pennsylvania. But that's where they're able to ask all of the questions because it's all about relationship building. At its core, success with a multilingual parents really depends on the strength of the relationship of the people that are really there being the intermediary. I would also say that teachers are also really savvy with technology. So they're using apps that translate things, like Class Dojo is a free app. Universal Campus is another app. These things are, if they text parents, they're able to do it in multiple languages. It's not just in English. But I think these are different ways that I found have been incredibly important ways for parents to feel as if they have access to the school staff and the teachers, and that it's okay for them to actually ask questions and to be able to invite communication. So I'll just leave it at that.
I just want to say something practical too, that if you're an educator listening to this and you want to know how to feel, let your Asian students, feel more connected to you or connected with their parents, we're having an API Heritage Festival this Sunday at the Cherry Hill Library from 1:30 to 4. There's going to be kids' activities, cultural performances, food, lots of tables set up. We're going to have speakers, including Congressman Andy Kim. So come out if you're available, show your support and solidarity and that you care. And I think it'll really, make the day of some of your Asian students to see their teachers coming out for this event.
Thank you very much. We are getting close to the end. The time has passed quickly, but we will pose one more question for our group to discuss. And so here it is. So how can parents, as well as teachers, know if a child or an Asian student is not doing well or needs some sort of support or help, like counseling?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of ways to go about this. I think one that I see very common within a lot of API families is, I think sometimes, our students, our kids, they often do come to us saying, I actually do feel depressed, or I'm feeling anxious, or I'm feeling a particular way. But then what we do is we try to, not that we try, but oftentimes we minimize what they're thinking and what they're feeling. And we kind of say, it's going to get better. And we kind of just put it on a back burner, and we kind of just completely ignored what they're just trying to say. And they're very explicit about it. So I think, like, just in such a simple, but also difficult way, the moment that a child says any of those things, I think that's just a sign you should take them. There is no should I weed it out to see if it gets worse and then take him? The best type of practice is, early intervention and preventative practice, right? So it's like just allowing them to be able to go just see a counselor or a therapist, or even in the school, like if a child does come up to you and you're an educator, just allow them to just go get the opportunity to talk with the counselor at school or the school psychologist, if your school does have one. And I think that's like one of just like the first means. And like earlier, you talked about I think Class Dojo. There's something called Go Guardian. I think Dino is another one that a lot of school districts use. So these are also preventative ways, even for school districts, to catch certain words or certain phrases that students might use in order to help them get like any sort of counseling needs that they might have, and give an opportunity for everyone else to kind of chime in as well.
I agree with what Dan said about how I think, our just society in general has this very reactionary model, to mental health care, where, we wait until things get so bad, where there's like a crisis happening, until we finally pay attention to problems that have probably been brewing for a little while, and this is definitely the case in the Asian American community. There's data on this that I've shared with the panelists before, actually, about although Asian Americans as a whole have low rates of mental health service use, when they do actually access the system, the rates of severe presentation in emergency room visits, with things like psychotic symptoms, is actually at higher rates than the general population, because there is such a prevalence of delayed help seeking until things have worsened to the point where things are so bad. And so that's a pattern that we're seeing. It's very problematic. But in addition to that pattern, it's also the case that we just happen to have a system in place where typically the students who get flagged, for adult attention and concern are kids that present with these sorts of externalizing behaviors, and like being disruptive in class, having failing grades, being impulsive, getting into fights, skipping school, right? But in general, although not always, a lot of our Asian American students tend to have more internalizing symptoms and behaviors, things that are a little bit more invisible, right? Like headaches and stomach aches, and just feeling tired all the time, or problems sleeping, excessive worrying. So those kinds of things are much harder to catch the attention of even the most, caring teachers or parents. So just to be mindful of those differences in the ways that distress can present, that it's not always obvious, right? So I guess in general, I would just suggest taking more of a proactive approach, as Dan was kind of suggesting, is kind of assuming that all of our students, including our Asian students, are probably struggling with something, and so instead of waiting for some sort of incident, we should be trying to invite them into spaces where we normalize talking about mental health, creating atmospheres where it feels safe to acknowledge when you're having a hard time, where they see adults are modeling what it looks like to practice things like self-care, right? So for educators, maybe it's taking breaks in class to breathe together, saying out loud how it is that you're paying attention to how your body's telling you to slow down, acknowledging that this assignment that they just gave you is really, really overwhelming, and how to ask for help. For parents, it's probably, and I'm guilty of this, putting your phone away and looking at your child in the eyes when they're asking you a question, right? Intentionally being present with them in the moment, even when you've got work piling up, right? Lots of things going on. Just taking those still moments. Sometimes it's sharing how hard your own day was, right? And giving an example of how you took care of yourself. Even though maybe initially, maybe you were tempted to beat yourself up. So there's lots of things, little things that we can be doing, I think, to embody some of this for our kids. It doesn't always have to look like taking them to a therapist, although obviously I advocate for that, being a therapist myself.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I will ask Vera to be able to respond to one more question, and it's focused around just has have you noticed that all the AAPI parents, their level of anxiety has increased since racist incidents have been increasing during COVID, and possibly affecting their children negatively? So I pose that question to Vera, and then everybody on the panel, I'll ask you to consider just a last comment as we round off and close this session. So Vera.
So I would say that some of the recent research, the COVID-19 research that I've been reading, that there certainly is, because of the increased awareness of anti-Asian hate, that's something that parents are concerned about. But I think we also have to look at the impact it's having on the youth. And I was just typing a response, actually, that's my sister, Yvonne, that the Center for American Progress actually had mentioned that there was about 50% of the AAPI youth that they surveyed as having these thoughts of depression and suicide, right? And this was at the start of the pandemic. So I think that that we have to wonder, like, how parents are responding to that, or to the seriousness of that. But we have to also pay attention that AAPI youth, a lot of them are really suffering because this is something they know is happening, and it's not something their parents can shelter them from. So I do think that there are multiple sort of issues, and how parents and their youth are handling it are very different in very different ways. So I haven't, in my research, because it was kind of ceased when schools stopped. It was right before COVID-19 closed schools, but I haven't had a chance to directly talk to immigrant parents. But I do think, just from the research that's gone out, that we definitely know that it's impacting families in general.
Thanks, Vera. And I'll open it to Jess and Daniel if you have a last comment to help close off our time together.
Sure. I just want to say that I really appreciate that question that some of the, two attendees had asked before, about why it is that we should care about Asian American youth when they're doing well. And it just makes me realize that we probably need to have a whole separate webinar on the model minority myth and why it is so problematic and harmful. Just a whole webinar devoted to that, because there's so much data to dispel that myth. That's really, really important to really explain in a way that's not rushed, but that really helps people understand, because it is so pivotal and fundamental to helping bring more awareness to some of our needs and our issues. So I just want to mention that.
Yeah, I just wanted to really thank everyone for this space for us to just have this dialogue, and for those that have tuned in. Wanted to do one more quick plug for that the Heritage Festival this Sunday. Me and my students will be running a table, so we'll have some games and food set up. So definitely stop by. Don't be afraid to just have a conversation with us.
All right, great. So thank you so much. Just to recap, number one, thank you for taking time out of your night to come hear what was shared by our panelists, Jessica Kim, Daniel Park, and Dr. Vera Lee. We do hope that you were able to learn something from this. And like I said before, that even you're generating more questions, things that you want to explore in order to address some of these concerns that were presented tonight. Please come to the festival if you're able to show your support. And I can say the last piece, as an educator, our goal is to serve children and their families, safety being the number one priority. And often people think safety is a physical piece, but it's much more and beyond that. And so again, feel challenged and convicted in regards to providing better supports for all of our students, and also our AAPI students as well. So have a great night, everyone, and we hope to see you at the festival. Thank you, panelists.
Is there any way we can paste the resources into the chat? I'm not having access to that for some reason.
I can try to do that right now. For those of you who are still here, we will paste. There we go. If you'd like to copy that as well. And this will be recorded, so folks can access this video at some point. Not sure how that's going to happen yet, but we will get it out to the community. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Principal Park, for moderating. We really appreciate it.
you.
You doing that for
Thank
us. Thank you.
Thank you guys.
All right, good night.
Have a good night.